Our guest speaker is Sisti. So she'll be giving her presentation first, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A session that'll be live with Abby. So if you guys have any questions throughout her presentation, you can throw it into the Q&A section. There's a tab on your Zoom screen. You can throw it in the Q&A and we can ask those questions to Abby after her presentation. Following that, we will have a Lobster Palooza game going over some of the regulations and laws surrounding the American lobster. And then we're going to wrap it up with a lot of people's favorite lobster trivia using Kahoot. And with that, I do want to introduce Abby. So she is currently a PhD student over at VIMS, and she's working in the biological sciences program. Abby's also been a Virginia C participant, so she's actually created a lesson related to her research that can be found on the Virginia C website. So if you're a teacher interested in learning more about her research and how to teach about it, her lesson plan does a really great job of doing that. And with that, I will turn it over to Abby. She can introduce herself a little bit more and get started with her presentation. And again, you guys can throw any questions in the chat or in that Q&A section, but I'll turn it over.
All right, thank you so much, Tara. I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen and can hear me all right.
Yep, you look good.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm so excited to be talking to you all today a little bit about lobsters and my research. As Tara said, my name is Abigail Sisti, and I am a third-year PhD student here at VIMS. And my research focuses on both lobsters and oysters and trying to understand how those two species might respond to climate change. So I was really excited when Tara asked me to come and speak to you all today and talk about lobsters, specifically one of my favorite topics, baby lobsters, and how they respond to temperature. So that brings us to tonight's talk, In Hot Water, an American Lobster Story. So today's talk is going to come to you in 3 parts. So in part 1, I want to introduce you to the lobster and talk a little bit about what their lives are like. Next, I want to talk a little bit about uncovering how these developing lobsters respond to temperature. And finally, using that information to uncover the mysteries of how lobsters might change in the future in response to climate change. So let's dive right in with part 1, introducing the lobster. There are many different species of lobster that live throughout the world, but my research focuses on the American lobster, Homarus americanus. Now, this lobster is probably best known in Maine, where they're known for being caught, sold, and eaten in large quantities. But the American lobster can actually be found all the way from Eastern Canada down to North Carolina and even Georgia by some accounts. That means there are lobsters here in Virginia, although sadly, most of them live pretty far offshore and deep in the water. Now, the lobster fishery is really important to the economy. Across its entire range in 2019, this fishery was valued at $630 million. So that means lobsters are very valuable and many people rely on this species for their livelihoods. So we mainly see lobsters as adults looking something like this on the screen, and that's usually around dinner time. But lobsters live long and complex lives. And these images here are just a small indication of what their life cycles are like, from eggs to larvae or baby lobsters newly hatched, to juveniles that are growing, all the way to adults who molt, grow, and reproduce, starting that cycle over. So let's dig into that a little bit more. When a lobster releases her eggs, she holds them on the underside of her tail, shown here, and those eggs develop for 9 to 12 months. That is a really long time. That is as long or longer than it takes for a human baby to develop before it's born. So those lobster eggs are taking a very long time to get it just right as they develop before they hatch. And once those eggs hatch, they release baby lobsters or larvae into the water. Those larvae live at the surface of the water where they float with the currents. And this floating with the currents in the surface water makes them plankton. And those larvae who live in the plankton are also eating other tiny little critters that also live in the plankton to help them grow. So lobsters have a hard outer shell called an exoskeleton, and to grow, a lobster must molt, which means they're shedding off this exoskeleton and forming a new, larger one to hold their growing bodies. Lobster larvae molt a lot because they're developing so quickly. And each time those larvae molt, they're getting closer and closer to becoming adult lobsters. So in this picture here, we can see lobster larvae that have just hatched. And every time they molt, they get a little bit bigger and they change a little bit more until we get something that looks a little bit more like an adult. And I've shown a picture here of an adult lobster molting, shedding that old exoskeleton here and replacing it with a new one, so you can have a little bit of an idea of what that process looks like. Now, after those larvae molt about 4 times, they're ready to move from the surface water in the plankton to swim all the way down to the bottom of the water where they're looking for shelter or somewhere to hide from predators. And shelters often look something like this, under the rocks. Now, once those lobster juveniles get to the bottom of the ocean floor, they stop eating those tiny little plankton from the surface water, and they switch to eating more urchins, clams, and even small crabs. So as time goes on, those juveniles continue to molt and get bigger, and they start to look even more like little adult lobsters. Eventually, they do reach full size, they mate, and then the entire life cycle starts again. Now, I am really interested in these lobster eggs and lobster larvae because a female lobster like this one can release up to 10,000 eggs that she holds under her tail. Now, you might not be able to count all of these eggs in this picture, but you can trust me that there are thousands in there. But only a very small portion of those eggs actually hatch and survive to adulthood. And one of the things that determines which of these larvae survive to adulthood are the environmental conditions around them, including temperature. So one of the things that I'm interested in is understanding how that temperature determines the condition of those eggs and larvae, which eventually contributes to how many larvae get added to the population. And as we discussed earlier, that population is hugely valuable. So understanding how the environment affects these tiny eggs here can help us determine how the population and the value of the lobster fishery might change in the future. So that brings us to part 2, in hot water, understanding how lobsters respond to temperature. So everyone has an ideal temperature. I like to set my thermostat at around 73 degrees, but everyone has their own opinion. Now, lobsters have an ideal temperature too. They really like it to be cold. And that's why we find so many lobsters up north in Canada and Maine and other parts of New England. And why the lobsters that live down here in Virginia try to find places that are deep and offshore so that they can get closer to that ideal temperature. Now, once that temperature starts to deviate from ideal, or even if it changes naturally with the seasons, different functions in the body start to change too. Now, to think about what that means, you can picture yourself going out on a hot summer day. How does your body change in the heat? Well, you might start sweating, your heart might start beating a little bit faster, and you might start breathing a little bit heavier. Well, lobsters aren't all that different from us. When the temperature goes up, their hearts start beating a little bit faster, and they start consuming more oxygen, similarly to how we breathe a little heavier. Now, this video here of a lobster larvae, in this black dotted circle here, you can actually see the larvae's heartbeat beating right there. Hopefully you can see that. And so when the water gets warmer, that heartbeat gets faster and they consume more oxygen. So what you might not recognize when you're going out on a hot summer day is that all that heart beating and heavy breathing is our body trying to give us more energy. Because when the temperature gets warm, all of the processes that are happening inside start to speed up and they require more energy to continue. So in lobsters, we can see this a little bit by looking at the eggs and looking at the larvae, because those eggs and larvae are developing pretty quickly. And as the temperature increases, that development gets faster too. So I've shown you 3 pictures of lobster eggs from under the microscope in these images here. And one of the ways that we can see how lobster eggs are developing is by looking at the size of their eyes. So these blue eyes get bigger as those lobster eggs develop or get closer to hatching. And also this greenish yellow area here are energy stores called lipids that the eggs start consuming as they develop. So they're using up their energy in order to get bigger and ready to hatch. So in warm waters, that eye spot gets bigger faster, and they use up that energy storage much faster as well. So that just shows how all of that energy that's being increased, they have to take more in as temperatures get warmer, is being used for different bodily functions that are also changing, such as development. So with all this information about temperature, how can we predict how lobsters will change in the future? So that brings us to part 3. As we look towards climate change and how temperatures might change in the future, what does that mean for these developing lobsters? Well, we can start by looking at what we've already discussed, what we already know. When water gets warmer, development gets faster. So what exactly does that mean? Well, if lobster eggs develop faster, they might hatch earlier in the season. Now, lobster larvae that have just hatched really depend on their food source, all of those plankton that are living in the surface water. So if those larvae hatch before those plankton have time to grow, it could possibly mean that those larvae won't have as much food to eat. Another possibility is that if those lobster eggs use up their energy stores faster during development, they might not have as much energy at the end of development to help them hatch and to support those larvae right after hatching. This faster development also affects the larvae themselves. So with warmer waters and faster developments, these larvae will molt more quickly. And that usually means that they don't have as much time to get bigger before they molt. So by the time they reach juvenile stage, it's possible that they will be smaller than lobster larvae that started in cooler water. And this might not be a good thing. However, this faster development also means that those lobster larvae will be ready to leave the plankton sooner in warmer water. And while the plankton has lots of food, it also has predators. And so if those larvae can leave the plankton faster and avoid those predators, it could potentially be a good thing. Now, I haven't shown this here, but it's also possible that temperature can get so warm that it actually lowers the survival of those eggs and larvae because it takes too much energy just to survive those temperatures than the lobsters can provide themselves. So these are all possible ways that changing temperature could change the lives of these developing lobsters. But temperature isn't the only thing that's changing in the ocean. In addition to temperature, climate change is expected to change the pH of the ocean, and this is a process called ocean acidification, the salinity of the ocean, if the amount of precipitation like rain and snow changes, and also the sea level. So these are all parts of the environment that might change in the future and could affect lobster eggs and lobster larvae, these developing lobsters. So with all of these changes, how can we possibly predict what's going to happen to lobsters in the future? Well, here at VIMS, one way that we do this is through laboratory experiments, like one that we just finished a few months ago. So for this experiment, we shipped lobsters from Maine all the way here to Virginia, and we put them in our aquarium system. And these lobsters were all females that were carrying thousands of eggs under their tails. And we kept these lobsters in different temperatures and different pHs for 6 months while those eggs developed and as they hatched. And we collected those eggs every month as they developed and those larvae after they hatched, so we could understand how they were changing in the different environments that we put them in. So all of this information gave us clues as to how the lobsters' lives will change in the future. And those clues included information about development. So every month we took pictures of those lobster eggs under the microscope and then the larvae when they hatched, so we could see if they really were changing how quickly they developed in different temperatures and in different pHs. We also measured how much oxygen those eggs and larvae were consuming so that we could get an idea of how their metabolism was changing. Just like we discussed earlier, when you go out on a hot summer day and consume more oxygen, we wanted to know if these eggs and larvae were consuming more oxygen in the warm treatments. And finally, one interesting opportunity that we had was to take videos of the adult lobsters that were holding these eggs. And this was important because these adult lobsters have little appendages called pleopods, and I'm circling them here, and they help lobsters swim. But they also can flap, like in this video, to bring oxygen to those eggs. And by bringing oxygen to those eggs, it's possible that those lobsters could make the environment less stressful, even though the environment around them is changing. So together, by measuring development, oxygen consumption, behavior, these are all metrics that we use to improve our understanding of how this life stage, these developing lobsters, will respond to ocean acidification and temperature, those two environmental factors that we know could affect developing lobsters. So, in summary, we know that lobster eggs and larvae are important to supporting this valuable lobster population. We also know that temperature changes the development and the survival of these developing lobsters. With climate change, we know that temperature and other environmental factors like pH are expected to change. And we can use laboratory experiments like the ones we run here at VIMS to understand how these environmental changes will affect developing lobsters. So ultimately, we might have an idea of how this very valuable population might change in the future. Now, we've just finished up that laboratory experiment a few months ago, and we're still working to understand all of the results and determine whether what we found is similar to the possibilities I presented earlier in this talk. But I'm really excited to be sharing the work that we've done so far with you all tonight. And I would love to take any questions that you have before you start the lab portion of tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abigail. That was a really great presentation. I personally am not a lobster expert. I haven't really studied that animal very much. So going through your lesson plan and also hearing your presentation, definitely feel more confident talking about lobsters in the future and really learning about their importance in our ecosystem, especially further up north. But we do have a couple questions that just came in. The first being, based on what you know, what is the range of temperature and pH that lobsters prefer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for temperature, lobsters can, while they prefer cooler waters, lobsters can survive a large range of temperatures. So in the Gulf of Maine, where the lobsters that we collected are from, temperatures in the winter can get down to almost as low as 0 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty cold. And lobsters can survive up to 20 degrees Celsius. But once they get beyond that temperature, things get tricky and they don't survive as well.
Great. And then what is the average life expectancy, or how long do lobsters, the American lobster, usually live for?
Oh, that is a good question. It's a hard one because a lot of the lobsters that we collect are ultimately collected for eating. But the lifespan of the lobster really depends on when infection might set in or what natural predators there are. The exact lifespan isn't well known because they can live a pretty long time.
Great. And this is actually a question I had too. So we all know about there's aquaculture farming for various species, even oysters, there's farming for that. So are there any kind of farms set up for oyster or for lobsters?
That's a really good question. And there have been attempts in the past to have lobster hatcheries. And actually, in Europe, for a similar species, the European lobster, there are hatcheries. But it's quite difficult to raise these animals for food because it takes so long. And instead, a lot of these hatcheries are about getting those lobster larvae to be released back into the environment to help support the natural population. So there were attempts to do this with the American lobster many years ago. I don't believe that there are any hatcheries running now, but there are some in Europe that are trying to do that.
That's interesting. And you talked earlier about, you looked at the different water quality parameters that lobsters are best equipped for. When it comes to the eggs and their survival, what temperatures do you see are when they become unstable, like they can't tolerate that temperature for the eggs?
Yeah, so the eggs we believe are quite similar to the adults. Because those eggs are held under the adult's tail for their whole development, they're experiencing the full range of temperatures that adult lobster is experiencing. So we think that their tolerance is very similar. And the eggs are actually really interesting because they need, generally, they need it to get really cold in the winter so that they can all hatch at the same time. So they have a similar needs as the adult lobster, but those seasonal changes of temperature where it gets cold in the winter and then warm in the spring help determine how fast they develop and when they hatch.
Okay. And speaking of eggs, someone's asking what percentage of the eggs actually hatch.
That's a good
That might
question.
be tricky to answer.
I don't have an exact number for the percentage that hatch, but I have seen some reports that the number that survive to adulthood is around 1 or 2%. But the number that actually hatch, I'm not sure of.
Okay. I know there are lots of animals. I used to work with an octopus where, a very small percentage of them make it to adulthood. So I'm not surprised with the lobsters as well. This is kind of interesting. So someone's asking about so they start by introducing the topic of lobsters having different colored carapace or shells. Have any of your test subjects come out with different colored shells, given the different tests you're doing with the pH, temperature, salinity, etc.?
That's a good question. So none of our adult lobsters have had any different color morphs that we've been able to see. I believe that it's generally thought that this is due to different proteins in the shell, but that's not something that we observed. But what you might see is the different colors in the lobster larvae that I showed in this presentation. And a lot of that is because that larvae is actually kind of translucent. And what you're seeing is the blue, for example, is the color of the hemolymph, which is sort of equivalent to their blood.
Okay. And I can kind of combine these next two questions. So they're asking, how deep do lobsters live? And then how far offshore of Virginia do lobsters live?
That's a very good question. So I'm not sure how far offshore in Virginia those lobsters live, just because I don't believe there are as many of them. So I don't know exact numbers on that, but I think it's generally discussed that lobsters can live anywhere from 10 to 700 meters, depending on the location. Or at least that's what's typically observed in the Gulf of Maine, where these lobsters are from.
And you're talking about in depth wise?
Yes, sorry.
Wow, that's very deep. Okay. Yeah, I know they're not the most common species we think of here in Virginia, but after doing some research myself and discovering that they are found off the shore of Virginia. It's a pretty cool thing. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, or if Abigail, if you're comfortable with throwing your email in the chat, if people want to email you if they have any further questions or they want to learn more about your work. And I think the last question I wanted to ask you was, what made you interested in studying this? Was this something that you did prior to coming to VIMS? What really piqued your interest, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So prior to VIMS, I actually studied a species of fish. So nothing to do with lobsters. And now I work with both lobsters and oysters. But I think what is most interesting to me is how climate change will affect different marine organisms. And I love oysters and lobsters both because they're so important to the communities where they're found, where they're caught. And so studying a species that's so important to people and is also so charismatic, in my opinion, is really exciting.
That's great. Well, thank you again so much for joining us this evening. You did give a great presentation for us. You're more than welcome to stick around for the rest of our Discovery Lab tonight. And if anyone has any further questions, they can definitely reach Abigail at the email that she put in the chat. But we want to thank you. So we'll give virtual high fives and round of applause for that. But thank you again so much. And with that, I'm going to share my screen very quickly. There we go. So the next part of our lab, we're going to do a short game. I've titled it Lobster Palooza. And so Abigail did a great job of really explaining the importance of the American lobster, especially since it is such a driver for the economy when it comes to the lobster fisheries. And so this was all information pulled through NOAA and their fishery department, and they highlight that there are 7 different lobster management areas basically along the east coast of the United States. You know, when we think of lobsters, a lot of people do think of Maine and Massachusetts, because that is where the majority of that population is found. But there are other management areas that run all the way down to even North Carolina. Even Abigail mentioned they can sometimes be found in Georgia even. But on this map here, we've highlighted those management areas. And through this activity, we are going to go through 5 different scenarios where I've caught 5 different American lobsters. And the objective is you guys are going to try and guess or determine if that lobster that I've caught is breaking a regulation or if it's correct. So is this a lobster that I can take home with me, or do I have to throw it back in the water? And because we're going to kind of learn through this activity that each one of these management areas has different policies in place for who can catch lobsters, what types you can catch, et cetera. So there's lots of different rules based on where you're catching lobsters from. And so with that, the first scenario, so I'm off the coast of, looks like Rhode Island here, and I've caught a female, it could be an egg-bearing lobster. So in the chat, if you guys want to put, if you think that this is a lobster that I can harvest so I can take it with me, or do you think I have to throw it back into the wild? So again, in the chat, you guys can put harvest or throw back. What do you guys think? Okay, so we had, everyone's thinking throwback so far, okay. Awesome. So we started off pretty easy. So you guys all got that correct. So you do have to throw that, that lobster back because it is a female. There are many different species like the blue crabs that are caught in the Chesapeake Bay. Females are thrown back a lot of the times. We want to keep that population thriving and growing. And so we don't want to catch the animals that are actually reproducing and laying those eggs. So same with the lobsters all along these management areas. Doesn't matter if it's Rhode Island or Massachusetts, you still have to throw that female lobster back. And then if you do catch a female, you will actually have to give it a little V notch. So here on my screen down here, there's this little V notch. So that tells people that this was a female that was caught earlier. So it just saves you some time and some hassle. And you just know next time it's caught, you have to toss that lobster back because you're not allowed to harvest that based on the policies that are in place. So nice to see you guys got that one correct. And so we'll move on to our next scenario. So I am now way up near Maine. So I was told that I could catch lobster all year round. So do you guys think that is true or do you think that is false? Okay, some people think false. Okay. Okay. A few more falses coming in. We got a brave one saying true. So the correct answer to this is actually true. So you would think, every fishery has a fishing season, which is true in a lot of places. Now, up in Maine, their management plan, they allow for folks who are permitted to catch lobster all year round. It's probably because the permitting process is pretty rigorous. It's also probably because it's a larger population of lobster up there. Whereas in other management areas, especially further south, they actually have a closed season. So you're only allowed to catch lobster, say down in like Virginia and Maryland. It would only be during the springtime. But further north, it is definitely an open season all year round. So they are allowed to catch lobster. So it's a little tricky there. Our next scenario, it looks like I have caught a lobster that is off the coast of New York, and it has a carapace length, which is that shell, that exoskeleton, which I've highlighted there, is around 3 inches in length. So do you think that this is a lobster that I can catch or a lobster that I have to release? What do you guys think? Some people think it's a keeper. Some say release it.
Yeah, we have a good mix for this one.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you guys ready for the answers? So in this management area, you would have to, I have to click the screen. That would help. You would have to release this lobster. In a lot of the management areas, pretty much all of them, lobster carapace length has to be at least around 3.5 inches minimum. So this lobster's got a little more growing to do before it's captured. And then they have a maximum carapace length, and most of it's between 5 and 6 inches based on where you are. But pretty much it's a safe bet between 3.5 and 5 inches. That's usually the ones that are really those keepers that you're allowed to harvest. So tricked you a little there, just shy 1/2 inch for that lobster to be kept. And so someone mentioned, so their slot limit on lobsters. So in certain management areas, they do have, a trap limit. And also we'll talk about this too. I don't want to really spoil it quite yet. There's another thing related to the size of the lobster, but they do have a certain limit to follow. So we'll come back to that question in just a moment. And this is the one I was going to talk about. So this is a lobster cage that I'm going to use to catch my lobster out in the wild off the coast of southern part of Maine. So do you guys think that this trap is legal? Do you think I shouldn't use this trap? What do you guys think? And you can put your answer in the chat. Do you think this trap is legal to use or illegal?
Also a good mix with this one.
Okay, So the lobster trap that you see here might not look like your iconic lobster trap that I have in that first picture, the big wooden ones. A lot of the modern lobster cages or traps that we see are now metal, kind of like blue crab cages. This actually is a legal trap. And the reason is it has this device right here, highlighted in yellow. So that is a lot of places call it excluder device, or it's basically a tunnel for the smaller lobster to escape. So this is a way for the fishermen who are going out and catching the lobster to make sure they're catching the size that is allowed. This allows for other bycatch to escape too, but mainly it is a way for the smaller lobster that they're not allowed to catch to escape through that slot or that tunnel. I think it's called a vent, an escape vent on lobster cages, but crab pots also have these different excluder devices for bycatch, but mainly for excluding the smaller sizes that are not allowed. So this is a very common trap that you would see pretty much all along all of these management areas. And I believe this is our last scenario. So I decided to go spear fishing off the coast of Virginia. And I was lucky enough, I speared myself an American lobster in those waters. So do you guys think this is legal, or do you think it's illegal for me to do? And you can put your ideas in the chat. Got a little bit of a mix here too. So if I were to go spearfishing off Virginia waters and I decided to spear an American lobster, I am actually not allowed to take that lobster home. So it is illegal to spear this species of lobster in a lot of these management areas, probably because it is such an important fishery. And I think some people get a little confused because we've all seen images or video of people spearing lobsters, especially down in the Caribbean or the Bahamas or Florida. And that's because it is legal there. So it is probably a different species of lobster. So there's lots of different rules and regulations when it comes to these species, but also when it comes to where this species is found. Because all of these waters, even though a certain part of it is United States water, we have state waters. And so there's international rules and there's state rules. So each of these management areas abides by their own policies, but pretty much all along the East Coast, you are not allowed to spear this species of lobster. So the ones you're seeing videos of, those tend to be further south, and different species of lobster altogether. And so that concludes Lobster Palooza. So I like to see that you guys were definitely debating a lot on some of those. I'm actually got to learn a lot myself about some of those species and some of those regulations that they have. But it's important to know, especially since that's such a vital and important fishery here in the United States, and such raises over $600 million a year. So very important to know about the policies and rules behind the fishery of the American lobster. And so with that, we will turn it over. We're going to do trivia to wrap up our evening. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull up, and I'll explain in just a moment. If you are not familiar with Kahoot, I'll explain how to do it. Just making sure I pull up the right Kahoot for you guys. Okay, awesome. I'm going to turn down the volume just a little bit here. So if you have not played Kahoot before, it is a trivia game. You can play using a smartphone. You can open another window on your desktop computer, and you'll want to go to www.kahoot.it. When you go there, it's going to ask for a game PIN number, and that's located on my screen here, 5010097. Once you've entered that, you will go ahead and put in your name. So I see some people coming in now, which is great. So you'll want to enter your name of your family, who's ever joining you. And Kahoot, like I mentioned, is a trivia game. So I believe there's 7 questions related to lobsters. And the objective of the game is, of course, to get the most answers correct. But in Kahoot, you actually get more points if you answer quickly too. So if you get it right and you answer quickly, you get more points. We are going to give a prize pack away at the end. So Sarah's modeling some of the prizes that we have available. So there's something to fight for this evening. So definitely the younger kids, if you want to grab a parent, help you out a little bit, that's totally great.
And also whoever does win, please don't log off at the end. Make sure that we get your email address so that we can contact you.
Yes, definitely. And then also, if you are not familiar with Kahoot, on my screen, you guys will see the question pop up. And then you will also see the different answer choices. They're either going to be true or false or multiple choice. And you'll want to answer your question on your phone or on the other screen that you're using. Okay. And so you'll use this device to answer, and you'll use the screen you're looking at now to read the questions and look at the answer choices. And so with that, if anyone is having any trouble with it, just let us know in the chat, but we'll go ahead and get started with our first question since we have a good amount of people joining us. Okay, so question 1. How many legs do lobsters have? What do you guys think? How many legs? We have some people thinking about this one. So good job, it's got that right. It is 10 legs. So you would think they would, at first when I was thinking about this question, I was like, it's definitely 8. But when we were looking at it, I was like, yeah, they got 10 legs, so 5 pairs. So good job there. We'll see who's taking the leaderboard here. But don't worry, we have plenty more questions.
I tried to give a hint.
Yeah. So how many lobster conservation management areas are there? Do you remember? So this will be from my Lobster Palooza activity. Nice. So yeah, there are 7 management areas that are located for the American lobster. And sorry, we went over 5 different scenarios for them. So that's probably where you got the 5 from, but
I almost guessed 5 and then I didn't want to give anybody the wrong answer.
Yeah. But we got some more people on the board, which is great.
Yeah.
So question 3 is true or false? Lobsters molt like crabs. So do they also molt like crabs do? Nice job. You guys were listening to Abigail. So yes, lobsters do molt. They molt fairly early, as she mentioned. That's something that they're studying, if that molting stage is affected when they're larval, in the larval stages. So yes, they do molt. Nice work, guys. Our next question, true or false? You are allowed to catch female lobsters.
I'm hearing screams of answers from downstairs.
Really?
Yeah.
It seemed like a lot of people answered this very quickly. So yeah. So as you guys remember, yes, you are not permitted to catch those females. We do give them a little V-notch and re-release them back. So you guys might have gotten some good points from being quick on that one, which is great. And so we'll move on to question 5. multiple choice. How many eggs can a female lobster carry at once? This one is a little tricky, but Abigail did mention it briefly.
That is a tricky one.
I'm going off of what Abigail mentioned.
It's a lot, I know.
Nice. So it is 10,000, between 7 to 10,000. There are some older female lobsters that can carry a little bit more, but definitely on average, she's usually seeing those lobsters carry between 7,500 to 10,000 eggs, which is still a lot. But yeah, good job, guys. We've had a little change in the leaderboard. We have some people on a streak, which is great. Okay, another true false. The average life, is it believed that the life expectancy of an American lobster is 10 to 50 years? And I know she didn't talk about this one, so this might be a guess for you guys. So it's actually false. They believe that the life expectancy of these lobsters are actually older than 50, around 50 to 70. They even believe some are close to 100 years old. Again, it can be hard to determine since they are captured for the fisheries, but the ones that do spend their entire lives out in the wild, they can live upwards to 100 years. So that's pretty
I definitely
impressive.
was going to pick true, so I would have gotten that one wrong.
Yeah.
Oh,
Nice.
moving up.
Okay, so I think this is our last question. What color is the blood of lobsters? This was a fun one to do.
Tricky. People are much slower to answer this one.
Yeah, this one. Wow, guys.
Good job.
Yeah, so lobsters actually, when the blood is in their body, they have almost clear white looking blood. When it is exposed to oxygen, so outside of their body, it's not red, it's actually blue because of the copper that's found in their blood. So there are other species in marine life that experience that same copper in their blood. But yes, while it's in their body, they do have a clear blood color. So let's check out our podium for lobster trivia. We have the Noel family in third, not bad. We have Maggie and Claire in second, and taking first place this evening is Rich. So well done. And Rich, if you want to throw in the chat, and you can just message Sarah and I if you'd like, your email address, and we can get in touch with you and set up a way to mail you your little prize pack and everything. But really well done, guys. I know that trivia, threw in some tough questions there, but you guys definitely did a very great job doing that. And so with that, if you guys have any other questions and you want to stick around, we can definitely answer those to the best of our ability. But we do want to thank you for attending our Discovery Lab this evening. And again, we will be hosting our Mad Lab October virtual Discovery Lab on the 26th of October. So feel free to join us then, and you can register online the same way you registered for this lab. It's going to be a fun time. We're going to be just doing some really cool experiments. So I hope to see you guys then. But thank you guys so much for joining, and I hope you guys learned something about our lobsters, and we hope to see you guys in October.